My name's Kate Mason and I'm from Australia. A report called Fault Lines, an independent review into Australia's response to COVID-19 was released earlier this week. And in conjunction with this, over the last few weeks, we've had mainstream media come out and start to say the obvious, that the most vulnerable were harmed due to COVID pandemic measures, that inflation has now risen, children's schooling has suffered, and all over it was a mess of conflictual and contradictory information given by well-meaning government officials. Some of the people, I'm noticing, some of the people who've been raising this for the last couple of years are finding some relief from these newspaper articles and the report Fault Lines, as though their suffering is finally being acknowledged. But nothing can be further than the truth. What we're now seeing is the mainstream media doing the job of their corporate investors and crafting narratives that bring in enormous control and global governance systems. For example, news.com.au has put out a few articles in the last few weeks, and I'll show them in a second. But what's really important to understand is that both Vanguard and BlackRock, the biggest investment firms in the world, are shareholders in News Corp, news.com.au. So here we have this article from news.com.au that came out 5 days ago. Yes, they claimed the vaccines would prevent transmission, and this is all coming out because the Pfizer executive testified before Parliament that they didn't test for whether or not the vaccine stopped transmission. So this article goes through and it names the different premiers and the chief health officers and talks about the contradictory and quite insane advice given by them. But this is the paragraph you need to be aware of within this article. Even the World Health Organization, as far back as April 2021, cautioned that if mandatory vaccination is considered necessary, there should be sufficient evidence that the vaccine is efficacious in preventing serious infection and or transmission. So the scope of this article is basically saying that our governments are really inept and bungling. And then we have the who is put forward as the as who we need to follow. They're giving the best advice. They're giving the most sensible advice. So you have to watch the way they're framing this. And here we have again news.com.au. This was put out today. Australia's huge COVID lies finally exposed. More than 2.5 years after COVID came to Australia, the truth has finally emerged and the lies have been exposed. So here again, it's talking about all the harms caused by lockdowns and heavy-handed government measures. So, and what it is now talking about is a report that came out earlier in this week called Fault Lines. And this report, when they talk about it here, these are the findings of the first and so far only full inquiry into Australia's response to COVID, an independent review funded by 3 major philanthropic organisations came out earlier on this week. Later on when I'm talking, I will dissect who these 3 philanthropic organisations are, because each of those 3 have arms, business arms in that will benefit greatly from the suggestions that this report puts forward. Over here, we have the Sydney Morning Herald, again talking about this fractured pandemic response failed the most vulnerable, independent report finds. So the report, Fault Lines, an independent review into Australia's response to COVID-19, looks on the surface as though they're finally stating the obvious and acknowledging that if you were not wealthy and a large corporate, you were harmed by the pandemic measures. However, the framing of the narrative and their solutions will usher us into centralised governance systems, including a Centre for Disease Control, which Labor is currently working on. The suggestions are data and surveillance heavy, involve many more opportunities for public-private partnerships that will give corporations immense power and control. The independent funders of this paper are 3 philanthropic trusts who all have business arms heavily invested in the technologies and social service measures and will profit immensely from the suggestions given in the report. Before I start talking and dissecting the Fault Lines report, one thing to really keep in mind is that to be able to bring in global governance systems, our governments have to be weakened. And so the public-private partnerships, which basically means corporations and government hold hands, as well as you get some citizen groups in there, that they have to be seen as the best way to keep government accountable. Here we have a prime example of the crafting of this narrative. This is Larry Fink. Larry Fink is the founder of BlackRock. And as I said before, BlackRock is one of the largest investment firms in the world, and they have shares in almost everything. So this was a letter he sent out to CEOs, The Power of Capitalism. This was in 2022. COVID-19 has also deepened the erosion of trust in traditional institutions and exacerbated polarization in many Western societies. This polarization presents a host of new challenges for CEOs. Political activists or the media may politicize things your company does. They may hijack your brand to advance their own agendas. In this environment, facts themselves are frequently in dispute, but businesses have an opportunity to lead. Employees are increasingly looking to their employer as the most trusted, competent, and ethical source of information, more so than government, the media, and non-government organisations. And now we come to this report that's dated the 20th of October 2022, Fault Lines, an independent review into Australia's response to COVID-19. I'm only going to pick out, it's about a 100-page report, but I'm only going to pick out bits and pieces just to alert. So first of all, I'm going to alert you to the narrative they're constructing. And when they construct these narratives, it's not that what they're saying necessarily is untrue. It's the way they are creating the narrative to bring in the solutions that they want to bring in. And that's what we need to be really aware of and really careful of. Like hand sanitizer in a paper cup, COVID-19 exposed the cracks in our health, social, economic, government, and political systems. The virus exacerbated pre-existing vulnerabilities. The pandemic impacted all of us, but its burden was not shared equally. The failure to plan adequately for the differing impact of COVID-19 meant that it spread faster and more widely. So basically all they're saying is that something that's incredibly obvious, that unless the people that were struggling more financially, the people that lost their livelihoods, the people, small businesses that were closed, children that really needed to be at school who couldn't be at school, who couldn't afford private, families couldn't afford private tutors, people who were not safe in their homes, anyone who had existing drug and alcohol issues and they might have been in support systems, people who'd lost their children and couldn't see their children through the foster care system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which is incredibly obvious and was always obvious that those people were going to be harmed disproportionately. So they're just now finally saying that. So how they've done this report is they spoke with 54 senior public servants across the federal, state and territory governments, 63 members of unions and community and civil society organisations, 29 senior business leaders and 49 academic and subject matter experts. They call this report independent a number of times, and they hold it up as it's apolitical, it's not influenced by government, it's instead independently funded by philanthropic organisations. However, and I will talk to this later, as I said, the 3 philanthropic organisations all have business arms in the technologies and the structures which the suggestions will support, their businesses will be supported by what they're suggesting within this report. So the funders were engaged throughout the writing of this report, but were always adamant that the panel must reach its own independent conclusion. So don't worry about it. They're just being completely benevolent, and it's not about business interests at all. It's forward thinking. It's not about casting blame. And they hope that many of these recommendations in this review are applicable to other crises. So it's not just about the next pandemic, which they assure us is coming, It will also be about climate change or environmental, economic, financial, geopolitical in nature. So they assure us that government responses will never be perfect and lessons need to be learnt. But, the people were really good, the Australian people were really good and followed their orders and did what they were told. But that, some of the government measures actually infringed on people's basic rights. The pandemic exposed major challenges in the availability and quality of data in Australia. So this is one of the first references to data, but it is continuously through this report. The lack of timely data on key community groups, internal migration, composition of supply chains, consumer spending, location of people for contact tracing, or linked health records made policy making harder than it needed to be. That's the narrative they're crafting. If you just unpack that one sentence, within that they're saying that we need to know where people are at all times. We need to know where they are through their spending, which implies that a central bank digital currency where you can track people through their spending. It implies that system is already in place or needs to be in place. In addition to the Coordination Commission, different businesses in the private sector filled some of the remaining gaps through close collaboration with governments. So now it's patting industry on the back for helping government. So we're talking about big corporates here because they were pretty much the only services or only companies allowed to operate during the lockdowns. And it goes on to talk about globally. So the international community and global and regional institutions need to do much better next time. So it's looking at a global governance system. Most importantly, Australia can seek to be a key player in establishing better international arrangements for responding to a future global pandemic. We're back in that global arena. So they sit the problem at many lockdowns were avoidable. Some were the result of failures in our quarantine systems, our contact tracking systems, a sluggish vaccine rollout, and shortcomings in our communication with key parts of our community. And they go on then to, again, say something that's really obvious, that lockdown overreach in 2020 and 2021 was as much a response to political perceptions of community anxiety as to expert advice. And we already know this because the Premier of New South Wales came out and said that the contact tracing, the QR codes in shops weren't even being linked in anywhere. It was just to make people feel safer. So it actually wasn't being collected. Young people have been particularly affected. 52% of Australians aged 18 to 24 have reported that their mental health declined during the pandemic. They not just this report, but other reports, and where we're heading now is that mental health is seen as very problematic because, obviously they've terrified young people and over the last couple of years, but there's actually a market in mental health, but I won't get into this for here. Governments and the Reserve Bank of Australia understandably overinsured in response to the crisis. Their judgment was that it was better to do too much than too little, particularly when faced with extreme uncertainty. But we're now living with some of the costs as inflation and interest rates rise sharply. So they're acknowledging that we are now struggling financially with our interest rates rising and insurance and food costs going up because of the pandemic measures, and that it's going to take more than 20 years to return to Australia's pre-COVID debt. And then because of that, it's probable that we see higher inequality and poverty than before the COVID-19 pandemic, again, stating something that's incredibly obvious. But however, the crisis had a silver lining. The dramatic increase in technology adoption. We saw years' worth of digital transformation occur within weeks or months. Telehealth experienced rapid uptake from 1.3 to 36% of consultations. Schools and universities quickly moved to online education. Many businesses became adept at running their operations online, even as people returned to educational work. It's likely that significant elements of the digital economy will remain incorporated into daily lives. So in other words, the pandemic and the measures put in place has meant that they've been able to rush through digital transformation of how we live and work in a way that you could never have done without this pandemic. Okay, so that is how they crafted the narrative. And this is what they're saying. These are the solutions or their recommendations that they are putting forward. So the Australia's pandemic plan was obviously inadequate. So governments need to incorporate a broader definition of pandemics rather than focusing solely on influenza. So we're going to broaden what is a pandemic. Plans are only effective if they're practiced. They should be scenario tested on a large scale every 2 years. These tests should be based on the World Health Organization principles. So anyone that's been concerned about the level of sway and power and control that the centralized global body, the World Health Organization, has had over our countries, needs to be really alert to the fact that the World Health Organization is being put forward as the supreme arbiter of how we need to do things. So now it talks about how we need to get government, public servants, industry, and hospitals, supermarkets, transport providers, also healthcare, the police, military, and some community organisations together. So they'll be working together, and it can't be limited to health issues. So it also has to map supply chains that are sensitive to disruption. So then they do this twice in this report. They give a call out to Victoria in particular about having more ethical, transparent governance systems in place. So Victoria has since changed its legislation to limit the role of the chief health officer in a health crisis. They've given more power to the health minister as an elected representative whose accountability to constituents and parliament may incentivise broader considerations of expertise at a time of crisis. So anyone who was on the wrong side in Victoria, where you were talking out or concerned about the heavy-handed tactics of the most lockdown city in the world, in Melbourne, or people who watched the brutality unfold in Melbourne towards protesters or anyone challenging the government, this should serve as a warning sign as to where this report actually sits. While Safe Work Australia provides guidance to assist workplaces in reducing the risk of COVID-19 transmissions, employers don't have clear legal obligations to take specific actions to reduce this risk. Enforceable workplace safety requirements could have improved protections for frontline workers. Well, I read this as more legislation, so it becomes embedded in law that people have to vaccinate. Okay, so recommendation to establish an expert body and trusted voice on public health. So they want to basically set up an Australian Centre for Disease Control. And this will, the failure to and why they want to do this, the narrative they're crafting, is the failure to coordinate key public health tasks across jurisdictions, including disease surveillance and data sharing. So politics and a lack of coordination were the issue. So COVID-19 highlighted the need for Australia to create an institution like the US CDC. It needs to be data-driven, and they need legal and technical capabilities to develop additional data sets. It should build on public health surveillance tools. So it's going to be very much about data, public health surveillance. It's seen as independent, and they argue that then it'll be more credible. Now, the Centre for Disease Control in America has been called out many times for its link to industry and challenged about its lack of independence and transparency. Recommendation 3, improve government decision-making through broader advice and greater transparency. A lack of broader expertise meant that policies may have unintentionally harmed children's education, skill development, and socialisation, and they go on to list other harms. So we need a panel of multidisciplinary experts and representatives. So they're going to act as an advisory body. And again, they're going to provide information. They're going to share data and collaborate on crisis response measures. So it's going to be another layer of government or government public-private partnerships. Establishing and maintaining professional relationships with local government, business and civil society should be a key performance indicator for government agencies and their staff. And they again come back to talk about Victoria and how successful it was. In February 2022, under new pandemic legislation, Victoria established an independent pandemic management committee to ensure the exercise of government powers is proportionate. So again, if you're concerned about things that have been going on in Victoria, you should be very concerned about this paper. Recommendation 4, enhance public service collaboration, capability and communication. Public servants must build and maintain networks of joint endeavour, not just between levels of government but with non-government sectors. Establish an interjurisdictional public service centre of excellence. Further investment in the analytical capabilities of Australia's public services need to ensure that governments can effectively use data during future crises. And with this public service centre of excellence, they would explicitly authorise and encourage strong partnerships between government agencies across jurisdictions while emphasising the significance of digital skills, data analytics, and managing and evaluating major projects. Governments should broadcast communications through a range of platforms tailored to different community groups. This should include much broader engagement through social media in a variety of languages. And governments should make much better use of the expertise, local knowledge, and involvement of community leaders in future health crises. Bilingual and multicultural engagement officers should be recruited to disseminate information directly to community members. So what this is about is that they state in this report that people from born overseas were relying at different times on information in language back in their own time, in their own country of origin, which leads to misinformation spreading. So when we look at what they're talking about, this interdisciplinary, these panels that they're going to create, where they've got a bit of industry, they've got a bit of the community organisations, they've got government sitting together, it's so that there's going to be one message. It's going to be really targeted. They're going to be completely set up. So when the next pandemic hits, everyone's ready to go straight away. Recommendation 5, modernise how governments use its data. They want to relax, or as they call it, enhance the Data Availability and Transparency Act and permanently amend the Tax Administration Act. Data played an important role in many aspects of Australia's COVID-19 response. New data partnerships were formed with Apple and Google, which allowed policy makers to track the impact of the public health orders on activity in near real time. Now, I personally wasn't aware that the government had a partnership with Apple and Google to track me. Limited linking of health and non-health data meant that policymakers were unable to design and monitor the impacts of public health policies. So it just goes through and it tells you that because we don't have strong enough data sharing or we have data protection laws, that they couldn't share the data they needed to. And then that this needs to be enhanced. These acts need to be enhanced. The Australian government should legislate an enhanced version of the DAT Act, that's the Data Sharing Act. Data sharing should become the default option. Data custodians should be required to demonstrate to the National Data Commissioner why sharing a data set with an accredited user is not in the national interest. So this is massive. They're talking about just data sharing as being the normal thing that happens. And if anyone or company or whoever it might be doesn't want to share their data, they've got to prove why they don't want to share that, and how it's not going to affect the public good if they don't share it. And interestingly enough, they have this sentence here: research on the efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines in Australia was impeded due to the lack of a pre-existing link between vaccination registries and patient outcomes data. So what I find interesting here is they talk about the efficacy of the COVID-19 injection, but they don't talk about the safety. Again, Australian governments must together commit to making the sharing and linking of data their default position, and that this would then become this data sharing. So when they set up that there's a continuous data sharing of all of us as citizens or, residents of Australia, that data is then used by the Australian Centre for Disease Control. And again, here, data custodians should be required to demonstrate why sharing is not in the national interest. And this is the final recommendation: establish an independent office of the Evaluator General. And this is all about evaluating, which of course, again, comes back to data. So they call it real-time evaluating. And to do that, we need another government body, an office of the Evaluator General. And the role of the Evaluator General should be to evaluate the public benefit of government policies. Okay. They then go on to talk about the next pandemic that's definitely coming. And they speak about this scenario. It's 2029. There's been growing media coverage over the past week about an illness. It's just arrived in Europe, and there's been 12 deaths because of this illness. So a team of analysts at the Australian Centre for Disease Control have been tracking the spread of this through the surveillance system that's really, robust at this point in time. Real-time health and travel data, which has been shared and linked. Our consumer spending, of course, which again can only happen if we have a central bank digital currency, and location data through its private sector partnerships. So they have location data on all of us. The National Cabinet is poised to meet on the weekend. An independent panel of multidisciplinary experts, including business and community representatives, have been stood up. So we get this panel up and going. They look and make sure people aren't being left vulnerable, which is how they justify all of this. Quarantine is still on the cards, but it will be more targeted. So who knows how they're going to target this, the quarantine, whether or not it depends on if you have any choice as to whether or not you want to take a vaccine, for example. The Prime Minister fronts the media. Together with colleagues, the Prime Minister outlines the plans agreed upon by the National Cabinet. It consists of an initial series of targeted measures. While the initial plan includes some restrictive measures, they're targeted on who, and temporary. The Prime Minister emphasises the strong tracking, tracing, testing and quarantine capabilities have already been developed through the Australian Centre for Disease Control. Australia's advanced surveillance system, real-time data assets, coordinated testing and tracing systems, and harmonised systems across airports and seaports are all in place. The Prime Minister outlines the targeted economic supports. The business and households most impacted are identified through linked, so the data is already collected on these people and these households through linked health and economic data from across Australian jurisdictions, and they received an advance payment later that afternoon. The Prime Minister's messages are immediately broadcast through government advertisements on television and radio in multiple languages. They aren't flashy, but they are released quickly. The independent panel's network of civil society and private sector representatives have activated, and it's already helped formulate the initial advice to the National Cabinet. It's working collaboratively with local government authorities and community organisations on how best to distribute these messages throughout Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and to culturally and linguistically diverse communities, youth and to senior citizens, people with disability and people suffering poor physical or mental health. So they just have in my view, have propaganda completely ready to go. Australia's returning from Europe, initially bringing the disease with them. Australia's quarantine facilities and contact tracing and testing processes prevent it from spreading through effective international cooperation led by the World Health Organization. So we're following global governance systems, and they go on to give us really the scope of what we are now living under. It is not the last outbreak Australia faces. The emergence of novel pathogens becomes more frequent. Australia faces similar and different diseases in the decades that follow. Australia's plans, institution and frameworks are updated following each event, knowing full well that the next one will never be far away. What we have now is a system in place which has been through the justification of COVID. We now have a system in place where we are a global system. We need to come under a global health Authority, which is the World Health Organization, and government and public-private partnerships need to be formed to track us at every single step to keep us safe. So what I want to say to you, if you have been concerned at all about the level of government overreach in the last 2.5, almost 3 years because of COVID, it was only the start. What they are implying within this fault lines report means that we are under complete government and non-government surveillance systems. I want to refute the language that this report, this fault lines report, has been paid for by 3 independent philanthropic trusts. So therefore, they are more trusted than government, and they are more trusted than having a royal commission. So let's look at who these 3 philanthropic trusts are and what their business arms are invested in. We have as number 1, Minderoo Trust. A business arm of Minderoo Trust is Fortescue Metals Group, which is iron ore mining, and their main shareholders include BlackRock and Vanguard, who I have alluded to earlier on, I've spoken about earlier on, who own pretty much everything in the world. So Minderoo Philanthropy focuses on digital identification, funding community organisations, funding university research, intensive data collection initiatives, and I'm sure more. The founder of Minderoo is Andrew Forrest, the 2nd richest man in Australia and a World Economic Forum contributor. Number 2, we have Paul Ramsay Foundation. A business arm of Paul Ramsay Foundation is Ramsay Healthcare, who owns private hospitals, mental health facilities, telehealth, allied health. Their main stakeholders include BlackRock and Vanguard. Paul Ramsay Foundation focuses on early childhood education, housing and homelessness, and are heavily involved in impact investing. And impact investing is where corporations or wealthy people can invest in programs that are being rolled out for vulnerable children and families, and they get a financial return on it. Number 3, John and Miriam Wiley Foundation. A business arm of John and Miriam Wiley Foundation is Tanara Capital Asset Investment Firm, who partner with a wide range of private-public companies. They promote themselves as environmental sustainable governance, ESG investors. They invest in emerging companies globally with an emphasis on, this is their words, disruptive technologies, robotics, artificial intelligence, big pharma, genetic research, biochemistry, dragonfly-sized surveillance, drone technology. They've also acquired a majority stake in Health Metrics, the leading cloud-native data-driven software solution. So combined, the 3 philanthropic trusts' business arms have stakes in digital identification, health, Big Pharma, genetics research, surveillance systems, mental health facilities, impact investing, robotics, artificial intelligence, data-driven software, and I'm sure there's a lot more. So the markets these businesses are invested in will make profits under the suggestions from the report, which they have paid for. So that's the elephant in the room. How can you call that independent? Can a philanthropy trust really be genuine and trusted if its business arm profits from their philanthropic endeavours? How do these philanthropic trust consultants get access to government, business and community services to be able to interview and survey them, to be able to write this report? And what are the ethical guidelines for this? How is this ethical? How is this democratic? We actually need to be really aware of this. What we have seen with this fault lines report and through the mainstream media reporting is going to be what happens. So things are going to get funded through philanthropic organisations, things that are, organisations that are charities, are set up for charities, and then they have those same charities have business arms that then make the money through what they're investing in through the charity. So it's kind of like giving with one hand and taking back with 2 hands. So we need to be really careful that we don't they will always say a little bit of truth. There have been huge amounts of harms caused by the measures that governments put in place through the last couple of years. That's incredibly obvious. That was always going to be the case. But they can use that little bit of piece of truth, and everyone focuses on that they've acknowledged that there's been some truth in, that they're finally saying we've been harmed. But, be careful, because the 80% of what they're bringing, 80% of the rest of it is what they're going to bring in to completely capture us in the future, where we will have no room to move. So it's really important, before we all share things, that we actually look at who are the funders. Why, if the mainstream media is saying anything, you have to be skeptical, because they are all corporate funded. They're not going to tell you anything independent unless they're an independent independent outlet. So always question everything, check the funders, and don't share until you've really done that research. We actually need to be very diligent.